Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. It's the 40th anniversary of my favorite hacking movie, Tron. It has visual style, music by synth pioneer Wendy Carlos, and one of the best quotes to summarize my favorite type of AppSec. That's Tron. He fights for the users. Which means this week we chat with Farshad Abasi from Forward Security about the security challenges that dev teams run into when they attempt to build secure software. In the news segment, trouble in 2FA for Python packages, lockdown mode reduces attack surface, a catalog of cloud vulns, naming post-quantum algorithms, and more. Get to that I/O tower and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly.
Your organization is building and updating business-critical web applications faster than ever. And with so much pressure to move fast, you may find yourself making trade-offs between innovation and security. Now you can build fast without sacrificing security with Invicti, the application security platform that helps your dev, sec, and ops teams work together to secure every website, web app, and API. With unparalleled accuracy, coverage, and automation, Invicti scales like no other AppSec solution. Discover why many of the world's largest organizations innovate securely with Invicti. Visit securityweekly.com/Invicti. This is episode 203, recorded July 11th, 2022. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
Mr. Shima, it feels like it's been at least 2 weeks.
Feels like it has been 2 weeks. Let's check the calendar on that. We also have someone new with us this week, Mr. Joe South. Hello, Joe.
How's it going?
Going very well. Glad to have you joining us this week. Quick announcement: do you have a guest or specific topic that you would, or a specific guest or a topic that you want us to cover on one of the shows? Submit your suggestions by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and completing the form. We review suggestions monthly and will reach out to you once reviewed. Farshad Abasi is an innovative technologist with over 24 years of experience in software design and development, network and system architecture, cybersecurity, management, and technical instruction. He started Forward Security in 2018 with a mission to provide world-class information security services, particularly in the application and cloud security domains. Prior to creating Forward, he was a senior member of HSBC Group's IT security team, with the most recent positions being the principal global security architect and head of IT security of the Canadian division. Farshad is continuing an 18-year stint as instructor at BCIT, where he shares his passion for information and network security, helping others build a career in this exciting field. Hello, Farshad. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, how's it going, Mike?
It's going quite well, and glad we have somebody who is looking to see that this is an exciting field, because really I think there's also some exciting problems that keep us employed and keep people like you out there talking and training others. And one of that is building secure code, which I think there's a lot to that, but just start us off with just what are some of the challenges you see from developers approaching or responding to that request from the AppSec team. You're supposed to write some secure code. Go forth and do it.
Some of the challenges, there's so many. First of all, I want to say I'm really excited to be back on the show. This is one of my favorite podcasts. We were talking earlier in the quote unquote green room about running and all that kind of stuff. And when I run, I usually listen to this podcast. So as I hear the intro, I'm like, oh, I should be running right now because I'm hearing the application security intro music. But yeah, thanks for having these podcasts. And I think they're quite valuable to people out there because, you know, we have a mission to raise the voice of application security because it doesn't have a strong enough voice. It's a fairly new, when I say fairly new, in the last 10 years, a newcomer into the cybersecurity field as compared to many other domains within cybersecurity that have been around for quite a while. So we're kind of the new kid. Application security is kind of the new kid on the block and is not getting as much attention as it deserves from the security community. But guess who's paying attention? Or the hackers, or the attackers, rather, I should say. Hackers are sometimes the good guys, right? The attackers are paying attention, and the numbers support that. So I think the last Verizon report that for 2021, I think it was around 90% of breaches had an AppSec attack vector involved, which is quite high. But it's not surprising because it's, AppSec has been left out for so long. But yeah, there are a lot of challenges, and I'm here to talk about them today. And I guess that one of the biggest challenges is the shortage of SMEs, because traditionally, application security is a complex field. There's a lot to know, and there aren't a lot of people that have that information. And software developers are often left on their own to try to figure this stuff out. And I can speak firsthand. I've been that software developer without support, and of course, I made all the classic mistakes in building my software. You name it, it probably happened in some software that I built. And why was that is because I was a software developer who was busy learning all those frameworks and languages and software patterns and a million things that there is to learn in the software world. And of course, I wouldn't have the capacity to learn everything there is about security to be able to do both. And not having had the support, I built software that got attacked and it got compromised, if you will. So that's one of the biggest challenges is access to SMEs, but there are a number of ways to address that. So yeah, I'm happy to deep dive into any of the areas, Mike.
Yeah, and you're hitting on some great aspects. One is that maybe AppSec has been around for a while, but maybe the value of AppSec, or maybe you may be able to say it this way, the impact of AppSec in the sense of we have a lot more secure software, hasn't been hitting such an impact until perhaps recently with cloud security and like infrastructure as code, some of these concepts. But what you're getting at too is that even you've written software, and there's a lot of things to think about. Building applications, understanding frameworks, just the making sure you're meeting business requirements. But we can't just do this with people. People are critical to this, but people need to be supplemented with tools, processes to help them on that secure code. So if someone does come to you saying, we need a tool, we need something, how can what can help me understand either security, or what can help me make secure code at the end of the day, or more secure code at the end of the day? What are, how do you handle that conversation? Is there criteria you send them to? Is there a maturity model of tooling you approach, or how do you unfold that with them?
All of the above. There's no magic wand for one thing. So that is, that's just a sort of here's a solution is going to fix all your problems. It's a multi-pronged approach. And oftentimes it starts with awareness. If the developer is aware of these commonly occurring problems, then they're more likely to not repeat them. And that's why something like OWASP Top 10 exists, right? Because OWASP Top 10 highlights the top 10, commonly occurring problems and things that you need to pay attention to. So that would be that's usually the first place I ask the developers to start, is that, hey, are you aware of the OWASP Top 10? Do you know those issues? Do you know how they happen? Now, often, once they get, it's easy to go and read that, but it's probably not going to stick. So you augment that with some hands-on activities. There are a number of good platforms. For example, OWASP has a project called the Secure Knowledge Framework, SKF. Secure Knowledge Framework is great because it takes all the different security requirements that a developer should consider. It explains them. It talks about what they mean. It has sample code in 4 languages. I believe it has Java, PHP, a couple of other ones. And if it's not there, it's an open source project, so people can contribute and come up with more examples for the languages, their favorite language. But he takes it even further. It actually has each of those issues in a mini lab. So rather than making one big vulnerable app that has a number of security problems, they have small working applications that each demonstrates one of those vulnerabilities. So for example, you'll pick one of the items in the application security verification standard in an SKF. You can deep dive into it. What does it mean? Can you show me some examples? And then can we run a lab that I can play with and actually learn this? So that's often my recommendation, is that, go and make sure you understand OWASP Top 10, and then second to that, go and look at what you don't understand, find those items in SKF, and then try to figure out, try to learn them. And some of the challenges with SKF in the past have been, it wasn't stable. There were some problems getting it up and running, but the good news is that, we rolled up our sleeves, myself and colleagues internally here, and, we're trying to contribute to that project to solve some of those issues. The biggest one was launching it. It requires Kubernetes, because, all the labs, they launch as Docker containers, and, we wrote some scripts and updated a few things that made it work, and we're hoping to contribute that back to the project. So yeah, OWASP Top 10, using hands-on SKF type stuff for you to for the developer to get a better sense of it. And then, of course, trying to address the low-hanging fruit through automation. One has to understand that developers don't have unlimited time. There's a lot of other work they got to do. So as much as where automation is possible, it's my recommendation to put that in place.
Yeah, I think I'm going to come back to the automation in a second, but I like that idea. The OWASP top 10 is sort of, this is why you should be worried about AppSec. Sounds like the SKF is saying, is helping us to reinforce, this is why you should be worried about AppSec that's relevant to your tech stack. And the ASVS is sort of that idea of, here's what you should be doing to secure it, rather than like the OWASP is, don't make these mistakes. ASVS is, do these recommended practices. And part of those practices do include scanning, some tooling to help that. So when a developer or an org comes to you and says, well, should we get the DAST, the SAS, the SCA, this tool, this other tool? What are some of the ways you help them, rather than just ask, do we need this tool, help them develop some criteria or sort of understanding the problems they have? What do they need versus what do they want type of situation?
That's a good question. Let's start talking about ASVS first, because you mentioned that a second ago. So first of all, ASVS is awesome. I want to give huge props to all those involved, Josh and Jim and that whole crew. I often say that our company's foundations are built around ASVS. Everything we do, it sort of revolves around ASVS and following those practices. For those who are not familiar with it, I highly encourage you, if you're in this field, to go and look at it as soon as possible. As soon as you finish listening to this podcast, go and check out ASVS. And it's essentially, it was designed initially as a bunch of criteria for application security testers to be able to test the application. But, similar to test-driven design, if you have a test case, well, the development can build to satisfy that test case, and now the test will pass, right? So ASVS can not only useful for the testers, but it's also used for the developers and application architects to use it as a basis for their security requirements. Many times I encounter the development teams that when it comes to security requirements, they all look at each other and no one has any idea where to get security requirements from. They have all the functional requirements from the business, but the business team is not equipped to give them the non-functional or the security requirements. So I used to see that section empty in most of solution architecture documents. And the good news is that ASVS is here to help. When I worked at HSBC, we had our own standard for building secure applications, but it was a nightmare to maintain. And I can speak firsthand because I ended up owning that standard and had to deal with it. And, and you had to, get a bunch of people to contribute, and everyone's busy and it just drags on and it becomes a chore. While, ASVS is open source, everyone contributes to it. You benefit from global knowledge. And, if you adopt that in your organization, that's probably a really smart, wise decision. And you can adopt it as a basis and customize it if you need to, rather than reinvent the wheel and build it from scratch. Now, to answer your question about the scanners, yeah, there are requirements around that. Like ASVS says, hey, you automate where you can. And, there are other frameworks that recommend the same. But automation has lots of challenges, right? As we all know who are in this field, you put that SAS scanner, you put that DAS scanner, you put whatever that SCA scanner, what they're going to give you is a lot of false positives, right? Now, the really expensive ones, they claim that they don't have as many false positives. They reduce the false positive rate. But let's put them aside for a minute. Let's talk about the ones that do have a lot of false positives. The challenge is that the developer looks at the report that's produced by the scanner and they're overwhelmed because there's hundreds of issues, lots of them may be false positives, some of them may be real issues. So that triaging is a challenge, and the developer doesn't have the time or the knowledge to be able to triage them appropriately, right? Now, let's talk about the ones that produce less false positives. Well, those scanners are still going to give you issues, and similar problem. The developer doesn't have the security expertise to really understand what that stuff is. And some of the better tools, they give you more detailed description. They help you understand. They've got links that you can go check out, and makes it easier. But again, the developer's got lots to do. They got to build this stuff, and they don't have time. So the reducing the false positives, buying a commercial tool that produces more meaningful results, that definitely helps with the timing problem of the developers. But they need some mentorship to begin with. So when you roll out the tool as a company, if you don't augment it with some support, it's sort of like throwing the person in the ocean and say, go swim, right? You need to help them out in the beginning. You got to put some water wings and help them float. Otherwise they're going to sink before they even start learning swimming, right? So that's one of the things that we do with our clients. We when they go down that journey of buying buying a tool, we often support them for the first 12 to 24 months to make sure that they're successful. And we review the results with them, and we help them make sense out of that stuff. And of course, threat modeling is a big part of it. A lot of organizations just they don't do that. They don't do threat modeling, so they get these reports from their scanners, and then they look overwhelmed because there's 50 things that they got to fix, and they ask like, well, what's the priority? How do I prioritize these, right? And often the mistake they make is that they just use the severity ratings, right? But the tool has no context of your application or your business. That severity rating is a generic rating that was put into the tool, and it applies to every situation. And it's not really meaningful. What the company needs to do is they need to take that rating from the tool and then put context around it. Like, what is the business impact? Where is this issue occurring? Is there a threat scenario that could actually realize this particular vulnerability? Once you put all that stuff around it, then you can determine the impact and likelihood, and then you'll have a risk level. The risk level is what you should be using to prioritize these issues, because the risk has got all the context taken into account. And then you really know, okay, yeah, this is high risk, I should fix this. This is medium risk, I could delay this for 6 to 12 months, which is what's often common in financial sector, a lot of other organizations that I've worked at. And then if it's low risk, well, you fix it after you've addressed the high and mediums, right? But those are the challenges, is that the tools get too many false positives, or they have a lot of issues that don't make sense. It's difficult for the developer to prioritize them because severity doesn't have the context of their environment, application of the business. And then the other challenge is that there's a lot of tools, right? A lot of categories of tools that they got to implement into their development environment. And what do I mean by that? Well, they got to put static analysis, or the category we all know and love as SAST. They got to do software composition analysis, right? SBOM is a thing. Everyone's talking about it. So we got to do SCA. Then we got to do DAST, right? Because DAST, you have to do some dynamic testing. That's got its own problems, right? Like, how do you authenticate into applications? Is the DAST tool actually meaningfully understanding what your application does? Does it authenticate to it? Does it actually understand the mapping of your API endpoints? Like, does it support your REST API in a meaningful way? The answer is most of the time the tools don't, and the developers have no idea. So they'll deploy these multiple tools without understanding them. And then the big challenge is that each tool produces their own report. So, the vendors love to have their own dashboards, because every company wants you to live in their dashboard, right? Because it's important from a business perspective. And then what you end up with is like 4 or 5 dashboards, because you had that SaaS, that DAST, that SCA, maybe IaaS, and maybe RASP. And let's throw some infrastructure as code scanning and cloud scanning. Now you got like 6 different dashboards or reports, or whatever you want to call them, right? So that's the other challenge, is that often those reports aren't normalized. They're not presenting the information in the same way. So if the boss asks, "Hey, developer, like, how many issues do you have, and what can I see a summary?" That's not an easy question to answer, because you have to say, well, here's 6 reports, right? And then you either the team has to go and normalize them themselves, which is a lot of manual work, or they just have to deal with it. So now I know some of the larger companies, they're moving in that direction of having a central platform that does everything. When I was at RSA, I think Synopsys was going in that direction. I think I heard or saw that they're just going to have a platform that has their SaaS, because they offer SaaS and SCA and DAST and all that. And I think they've started to listen to the people out there that we want a single platform. I think other companies are warming up to that as well. But the challenge is that you get vendor lock-in, right? Maybe I don't want to use your SaaS. I like your DAST, but I want to use someone else's SaaS, right? So, if you go with a Synopsys solution, you're going to be locked in into that environment. There are companies, I think, I can't remember all the names. Is it Nexus or something like that? There are a few companies I saw at RSA that are dabbling in that. In fact, we're building a tool to address that centralization and aggregation of the reports and automation. So hopefully in the next couple of years, there'll be platforms, and including ours, hopefully, that will simplify that problem. But at the moment, those are challenges that the developers face.
Yeah, quite a bit. And I can't remember the acronym off the top of my head, but I know there's also just a standard to express findings from various, whether it's a code scanner or a network scanner, so that they could all interoperate and consume this data. I'll come up with that, drop that into Discord. But I wanted to pick up on one of the aspects you talked about. You mentioned, rather than just like, I think obviously nobody wants the false positives. They understand, the necessary for rollout. You hit a couple things that might answer this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, just in case. You said you follow organizations, 12 to 24 months later after they've developed, or deployed a tool. What does it take at that year mark or a 2-year mark to show value from one of these tools? Meaning, like, I think it's easy for us to say, if it's still showing false positives after a month of a proof of concept or a pilot, probably not going to hold on to it. So that's why I'm kind of curious, what does a year of value look like? Or how do you look at this a year later and say, is this tool giving us the value we need from the developer's perspective?
Yeah, and I think it's similar to how you measure value in QA, right? Like, have you reduced the number of defects? Like, let's face it, at the end of the day, things that that a tool finds, essentially defects for the application, right? Like, I mean, there's security problems, but there are defects from the application developers or the application owner's perspective. So in the same way that you do metrics on QA, you would look at, the number of defects and how it was reduced and addressed through that tool. If you want to get the most value of that tool, the best thing to do is to baseline it to begin with. The mistake that a lot of organizations make is that they'll bring the tool partway through their development lifecycle. They'll enable the tool, and the tool, of course, because it's never ran on your environment, it makes a big, massive list of issues. If you don't spend time in the beginning and do that initial baselining, and what do I mean by that? I mean going through that initial list, figuring out what are the things that are low risk, medium, and high, fixing what you want, and then skipping the rest. So you start with a zero baseline, so that the day that you roll this out to your developers formally and you make it a blocker in their CI/CD pipeline, hopefully, that it has no issues, right? Because if you go and put that in the pipeline and it has lots of issues and you try to make it a blocker, well, that's not going to work, because every time they run it, they're going to get blocked. There's 100 issues that keeps coming up, and the developers are often going to just disable your tool. But if you spend that initial time and you baseline it and you set it so that it produces no issues, and then you roll it out, and then if a developer checks some code in and then one or two issues come up, that's obviously because of something they introduced as a result. So that it's much easier. They go and fix that one or two problems and check the code back in. And then, of course, you measure the success over time. So you look at, how many security defects were found through it, and how many of those you were able to remediate, how many of them were meaningful security defects, and things like that.
Hey, Farshad, I want to back up a tiny second here. So you were talking a little bit earlier about threat modeling and how you see that really helping people be able to prioritize and triage how they do stuff. Depending on who we talk to, both here on the show or out in the world, we get this sort of polarization of people thinking either threat modeling is really not worth the trouble, or threat modeling is something that's super valuable. And as I'm asking this question, I think I might have asked you this before. So if I did, I'm sorry. But do you're obviously, if I did, you're triggering something in me. Do you see sort of a pattern of like which companies or which groups out there are actually putting investment into threat modeling? In other words, what is there some pattern that makes people want to go down that path to think there's value in it?
That's such a great question. I'm not sure if we talked about it, but I'm glad you brought it up. And I'm smiling because my friend Jeevan is coming in mind. My colleague friend Jeevan, he runs the OWASP Vancouver chapter with me. He works at Twilio, and they have managed to do threat modeling really well at scale. Often, and what happens is oftentimes that when companies say, let's do threat modeling, right? Well, it's great, but the developers don't know how to do it. It's hard. The security folks aren't able to teach them very well. They're not empowered or enabled, and lots of challenges come up. What you really need to do is you need to be able to enable and empower the developers so that they can do the threat modeling themselves, and making it easy for them to understand what it really means. And that's what Twilio has done really well. And if you actually want to guess, I'd highly recommend having Jeevan on the show. He'll talk about it at depth, and he's actually going around a lot of the OWASP events and talking about how to do threat modeling at scale and with success with software developers, right? I think he calls it self-serve threat modeling. But yeah. So and then the other thing is that there's different types of threat modeling that are applicable at different stages of the software development lifecycle, right? Like the traditional threat modeling that that's talked about is where you decompose the application into components and interfaces and data stores and functions, and you look at the data flow between them and that type of stuff, and then you figure out, if this link doesn't have TLS, there could be someone intercepting it, that type of stuff, right? That's great. That's great during the beginning, when the project is at the initiation phase, and it's also great at the end when the project is like almost ready to release. You do that architectural level threat modeling. But what happens in between? What if you're in a DevOps team and you're building things iteratively, you're doing agile, and you got all these user stories every 2 weeks in your sprint, and you got to look at them. that traditional threat modeling doesn't really apply there, right? Then what we have to do is we have to do functional threat modeling. And what it means is you have to take that particular function or that user story and figure out what the abuse case would be, right? So for example, if it says, the user story says, as a user, I should be able to see all the transactions that belong to me, while the evil story is, but I should not be able to see other people's transactions, or things like that, right? That are focused and specific to that particular function. And so we call that evil coming up with the evil stories rather than the happy path, right? But yeah, the challenges is often that the teams run into are that they just don't have the right support. And if they have support, those folks don't really understand how to teach developers how to do that threat modeling. So that is something that is a problem. That is a problem that we're hoping to overcome, again, through speaking about it at these OWASP meetups and spreading the gospel however we can, and putting out articles and helping the community.
I like that topic too, because to me, so for me, threat modeling is often the only tool I need is just a document, like a Google Doc, Word doc, what have you. And we started off, I was asking a lot of, maybe leading questions perhaps about tooling, about SaaS and whatnot. What tools should I use? How do I choose these tools? But if we do talk about threat modeling, especially at scale, have you seen tooling be part of that? Or what are some of the secrets of making, to John's question that you gave some good answers to, making it both appealing so it feels valuable to those developers, as well as being able to scale it in a way that maybe can be more than just relying on people?
I'm also smiling as you're mentioning that, because the answer is, I'd say, it's not a strong no, but it's a kind of a no. I've tried, and like there's the Microsoft threat modeling tool, which I'm sure most of us have seen. OWASP has one. There's a whole bunch of these. The problem with them, all of them focus on that sort of architectural threat modeling that I referred to earlier, right? They ask you, hey, tell me your system components, tell me the interfaces, tell me all this stuff, and then they create a diagram, and then they come up with issues that are very that are focused on that level, at the components level and the infrastructure level, that type of stuff, right? And the other problem is they just produce this massive list of stuff. Like when I tried the Microsoft threat modeling tool, I was like, wow, holy crap, there's so many things in here that just, are these useful? And my head was spinning. So and over time, every few years, I'll go and visit the tools that are out there, and I still find that there isn't a tool for this, and particularly when we're talking about functional threat modeling at the level of the user story, right? Because at that user story, you don't care about the entire system. You're not caring about its architecture. You're looking at that bespoke user story, right? Like, as a user, I should be able to press this button and it does X, Y, Z. Tools are not going to really understand that. So that really, the solution to that is really training the developers and enabling them, and then having them become part of that day-to-day conversation. And it's not hard. It's not really that hard. Is when they're defining that user story, right? Like when they're writing the happy path, as a user, I should be able to do this. All they have to do is put a comma, but I shouldn't be able to do X, Y, Z, right? So if you just teach them how to think that, hey, like before you put the period, make that a comma, and then think of the opposite of what the good thing would be. Think of what, hey, what you're designing should be used by the user to do this, but what could someone else do with that, right? If you do that, and it does, what we do is when a customer comes to us and they want to say go from agile or DevOps to a DevSecOps level of capability, we work with them in a mentorship capacity, and a sort of in a transformational capacity. And what I mean by that is, rather than saying, yeah, you know what, hire us and keep us forever and we'll just do this for you, we say, no, we don't want to do this for you. We want you to do this, right? Like, we want you to learn how to swim, but we're going to be there to hold your, we're going to be your water wings, or if we're going to teach you how to bike, well, we'll be the enabler for a little bit, and then we'll take the training wheels off, and then you go on your own, right? So in the first 6 months, we'll attend a weekly stand up, or maybe we'll go to their when we go to their backlog grooming sessions, or where they're looking at their requirements every 2 weeks. We'll participate in that, and then as they're picking user stories, we'll help them. And then in the beginning, we will drive the conversation around coming up with the threat scenarios, and then we shift it around and say, okay, you know what? Now we're going to sit back and watch you do it, right? And then they do that for a few months, and then hopefully after that, then they're self-sufficient and they can do the self-serve threat modeling on their own.
Is there a way, and maybe I'm touching more on now, like the organizational psychology or processes, and totally, I've completely thrown away all the discussions of tooling, because is there a way to make sure that self-serves or self-sufficiency stays more than perhaps just the month later? I imagine there's always perhaps just a natural kind of trickling away, a decay, if you will, of this waveform, to pull out some strange metaphors of they worked with you, they've learned it, and they're really excited for the month, but then like the threat modeling in these use cases or abuse cases or the but what could be worse sort of cases as you're describing them kind of peter out over time, and 6 months later maybe they're not doing it as much. Have you seen some ways to just try and make sure that those, you're still staying in shape? You've been talking about running, swimming, and biking. Help us with this triathlon of threat modeling.
I love that. Yeah, Mike, checking in on them every once in a while, like whether it's the threat modeling process or that automated scanner. What we do is every quarter we'll just do a review of are those processes still working, right? For example, with the threat modeling, so in the beginning you're holding their hand and they're being trained, and then once you let them go, then every once in a while we would stick our head in and see, take a look at some of the user stories that have been defined and see if anything has been missed. And similarly with the tooling, right? We had clients that had deployed various security application security tools in their pipelines, and we talked to them, and then they said, "Oh yeah, everything is working." And then one of our consultants went in there and threw a payload of like a vulnerable payload into the scanner, and the scanner caught it. So there was a problem in the configuration. So when they was scanning their application, it wasn't finding anything. So whether it's tool or whether it's a process like threat modeling, it's worth to audit that every once in a while. We find that quarterly is a good cadence for that, to make sure that the tools are still optimized and working, and similarly with the processes.
That's interesting. I'm always curious in anecdotes or things too, maybe not horror stories, but things that have gone wrong. Are there additional lessons from talking with customers over those quarterly check-ins that are either instructive for others to learn from and avoid, or things that have worked? You mentioned too, just throwing in that payload. Did the tool use that payload successfully, or is the tool still just scanning against the app that it was tuned to 3 months ago, but now the so many features have changed, that tuning is no longer works?
Yeah, I think, the horror story is that having a false sense of security, right? Like thinking that your scanner is working because you've deployed it, and it's running on every pull request, but it's producing nothing, right? That's the horror story, because in that one instance that I was referring to, not to be named who that is, but there was a fairly serious vulnerability that was in the application. So in the meantime, the team was thinking that there's no problems, right? Because there's no issues reported, and then we go in and there's actually a fairly big problem here, but the tool was not configured in the right way, and then the development team had that false sense of security. So that's a big problem, and that would be a horror story for companies that are in that situation.
Now, keep an eye on time. We might have to wrap up soon, but I'm going to squeeze in a quick question, just because fuzzing is a tool that I like to talk about. I tend to be perhaps over optimistic. It hasn't come up in anything you mentioned. I'm just curious, if we take fuzzing as an approach, security approach, have you seen organizations asking about it, adopting it, even using it successfully? Or perhaps maybe the better question is, if and when you think fuzzing might come into part of this acronym soup that we have for all the different tools.
100% fuzzing is valuable. And if we're thinking about like the classic definition of it, very valuable. We don't put it in as often as I'd like to, but the challenge with it is getting it working properly. And what I mean by that is that if the fuzzer is sending those malicious payloads, you also need to correlate it with logs to see which one of those payloads actually resulted in something happening. And setting it all up so that you get the right log results and sending all the payloads is often not straightforward. And that's a bit of a prohibitor for companies to get into it. We use it when we're testing, when we're doing pen testing of applications and that type of stuff. We often would leverage fuzzing, but in terms of deploying it in CI/CD, we haven't done as many of them as I'd like to, due to some of those inherent challenges of tying it all together and getting meaningful results. And it also takes a long time. So to deploy it in the CI/CD pipeline is fairly time consuming as well.
So then maybe one last question I have. Absolutely. Thank you so much for listening to us week after week, and that you've come back and chatted with us for the second time now. We'll have to have you back more. But let's imagine that you're listening to this episode on your next run a couple days from now. What's a reminder that you want to send yourself, or what's a particular message you want to make sure that you didn't forget to let everyone know about?
A reminder to send myself is to remember to do threat modeling regularly.
Oh, that's awesome. No, thank you so much, Farshad. This was a great conversation as always, and you're going to have to come back and bring us more about some running, biking, and swimming there. I think there's some triathlon and
Absolutely.
threat modeling we could develop here. I want to thank John and Joe as well. Thank everyone for listening. We're going to take a quick break and return with news of the week. Contrast Security secures the code that global business relies on. It is the industry's most modern and comprehensive code security platform, removing security roadblock inefficiencies and empowering enterprise developers to write and release secure application code faster. The Contrast platform automatically detects vulnerabilities while developers write code, eliminates false positives, and provides how-to-fix guidance for easy and fast vulnerability remediation. Learn more about the Contrast platform at securityweekly.com/contrast security.
Imperva protects applications wherever they live and at the pace of development. From securing applications at runtime to protecting APIs in any cloud environment, only Imperva offers a unified solution across edge, application, and data to help you achieve more and save money. Start a free trial today and quickly protect your web applications at securityweekly.com/Imperva.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Farshad Abasi about choosing tools and processes to help build secure code and how threat modeling can be a key part of that. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella and Joe South, and this is our news segment. 2 announcements real quick. Don't miss any of your favorite Security Weekly content. Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to any of our podcast feeds and have all new episodes downloaded right to your phone. You can also join our mailing list, Discord server to chat with us right now, and follow us on social media and our streaming platforms. Plus, don't forget to check out our library of on-demand webcasts and technical trainings at securityweekly.com/on-demand. And as I take in a big breath, because I've got 2 folks here with me, John and Joe, to talk about the news. And it's been 2 weeks, as John pointed out very kindly, since we talked. So there is quite a bit of news to go over. I'm just going to kick us off real briefly with an OpenSSL security advisory that I don't think needs too much discussion, but has a wonderful quote in it that I think sums up a lot of maybe perhaps the state of aspirational InfoSec. Part of the advisory says, note that on a vulnerable machine, proper testing of OpenSSL would fail and should be noticed before deployment. So I think if we could just add that phrase to pretty much all of our software packages, John, Joe, the 3 of us could be out of a job because everything's going to finally be secure.
Our job is done. Congratulations.
Yeah. It was brief. Sorry, Joe. You show up, and then this is the last episode.
We're already done.
We're already done. But perhaps it's not going to be quite so easy because there is not quite a tempest in a teacup, but I think a lesson in something to learn. I lost my alliteration there. Apologies. But the Python package index is doing a wonderful thing along with NPM and some of the other OpenSSF and Foundation are pushing package management systems or package platforms to move all of their to move to MFA, to 2FA, things like basically making it more secure. Here goes my brain. But as an example of some of the hurdles of adopting 2FA, a package owner on Python said, I don't really want to bother doing this. And so they pulled their package, creating a left pad type of scenario from NPM where that because this critical package, critical being measured by just popularity of downloads, disappeared. A lot of folks' builds started failing, and the package owner said, okay, sure, I'm going to throw this back up there, but I'm still, just so that builds don't break, I'm still not going to take up, enable 2FA for my repo because I don't want to bother with it. And by the way, if you're using Python 3, it has 2 functions that basically work for this package's use case anyway. So there's a couple things to unpack there, but I've been doing all the talking so far. So let me throw over to John or Joe, who wants to chime in with some different background on this or some ideas on what some lessons we could learn from here.
I don't know. There's always, at least for me on this one, it's just there's always going to be someone who wants to take their ball and go home, right? It doesn't thrill me. I think there's depending on looking at whichever of these package repos we have out there, from Docker Hub to Pippy to even really some of the Go stuff. So all these different, most languages nowadays and platforms have some sort of this thing. Kubernetes has it too with Helm and a few other ones. There's some level of trust that people aren't going to take their ball and go home. So we've seen this a few times over the years now with, it's usually not quite this blatant. It might be more either someone's doing something in protest where they're putting something malicious into the code, or someone else gets access to it and they put something malicious into the code, or like I said, we have this kid here, or excuse me, this person with takes their ball and go home. So it's, I don't know, the Python or the Python 3 aspect, as you mentioned, is interesting. I focused more on just the thing itself and what do you do. I don't know. At the end of the day, it's not a good look for me, right? It's all of us who are doing anything in public in this. We've got a paper trail behind us for people to see who we are and what we've done. So good luck on your next interview, I guess, would be my sort of point of view on it.
I wonder how much. I wonder how much testing actually went into it, and how much, review took place to try and catch it ahead of time.
Yeah, I think that's what highlights this. It's the interesting here is that, especially with supply chain, there's a lot of testing that you're going to get surprised about if your package just disappears, because, as John said, somebody just wants to take their ball and go home. And I think maybe there's that combination of responsibility for, of course, testing and having robustness of your code, as well as if you are going to create a critical package, or let's use the synonym in this case, I think popular package, there is a responsibility to make sure it can, there's confidence in the security of it, so it hasn't been tampered with. So I do think that Python and NPM and others are doing the right thing here. Perhaps there could be a lesson just on communication and support, because I think one of the aspects is we could also throw a FIDO key, finance a FIDO key for all these developers. But when you get into account recovery, and somebody says, I lost my FIDO key, and now you don't have someone who just didn't want to adopt, you have potentially someone who did adopt but lost their key, or somebody's maliciously, rather than attacking the workflow around the 2FA process, attacking the workflows around the account recovery process, which is part of the threat modeling that Farshad was reminding us to think about.
And you're touching upon something interesting. It's the whole usability of security thing, right? We've had on folks from Linux Foundation and other places over the years of I think the number's changing, but it used to be for a decent percentage. It's probably closer to 50-50 now. People are either commercially supported to work with open source, or if they're actually doing it for the love and on their spare time. But especially for that second group, we have to make this as easy as possible. If, as you're adding security, if you're increasing the amount of hoops people have to jump through, particularly what you just said, around account recovery, the thought that popped through my head as you're saying is that this can't be like Apple, right? If my little God device somehow that gets locked up and I'm out of it, I'm done, right? There's no real way to get back into it. So how do you? There has to be some sort of middle ground where a human can actually reach out and talk to that person or know that person. Maybe they're hopefully part of a community and someone can vouch for them, or there has to be some way to do that side of it within reason.
Yeah, it's definitely getting into the idea of web of trusts. But you mentioned Apple, which we'll come to in a second. But John, you pulled out talking about vulnerabilities. For those, I think, I can't remember whether you drive the McLaren or the Bentley, but for those of us who drive lower price cars like Hondas, there's a vulnerability out there that we need to be worried about. What is it?
It's the Bentley this week. The odd and even weeks are the McLaren and the Bentley. Bentley. So this is and I actually didn't get the link I wanted to in here, but it's in this blog post. So hat tip to Hackaday, which actually isn't hacking the way we think of it, but more hardware side. But the second paragraph has a link to the technical overview of this. So what happened here? Briefly, Honda has the ability, and I'm sure most car manufacturers have something like this. When you go chirp chirp on your little key fob, it unlocks the door, but that code which goes across is usually what's called a rolling code, right? So you can't replicate it and reproduce and have it go again. One of the tricks which Honda has in place, let me be a little more clear on that. So the rolling code idea is as you keep going click, 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 click on your remote, that the code changes each time. And that's a forward-moving process, right? So you can't go back and replay an old code. And they use what's called a sliding window. So maybe the next 2 or 3 codes ahead are legit after one has been accepted. So that window keeps going, and you can only do it within 4 or 5 of those predetermined codes, and that's the pattern there. So what someone figured out, and this is done so you can't do replay attacks, and that usually works. What someone's figured out is there is at least I couldn't figure, I didn't look too closely, or I didn't dig too far, let me say it that way. Someone has figured out there is a sequence of lock-unlock commands which you can send to a Honda car, which then resets that index pointer on the sliding window, and then you can go back and replay the codes which were outside that sliding window before. So it basically means that you're able to, do what you're not supposed to do. But what's interesting about that is, beside the fact they test on a bunch of different 2012 Honda Civics. It sounds like they all use that key fob, so it's probably more than just the Honda Civics. But there's a CVE out there for it, 2021 46145, for those keeping track. But the bigger problem here is Honda's decided they're not going to do anything about it. So, yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
I saw something that, and this was, I think, a couple weeks ago, where carjackers are now, they figured out a way to do a replay attack on your garage door opener. And so it'll open the garage door, and then they do another replay attack on your car to unlock it and get into it. And they're closing the door behind them, obviously, and people are waking up finding that their car is no longer in their garage.
That would make me an unhappy camper. I mean, think about it though, right? Usually your remote, if you're in your house, your key fob is maybe a floor away, maybe just a room away from the garage. So if someone's able to get there, even with the the keyless entry type stuff, once you get through that flimsy little garage door, that's not fun to wake up to. I don't like that idea.
Yeah, and it's, you mentioned too, Honda, the 2012, and the list does go up to makes through 2022 as well. So this is not just an old attack. And it is interesting to talk about threat models and proximity of people. How close do you need to be for this? So if I guess maybe the reason I'm kind of touching on that part is that if you want to do some practice threat modeling with your developers, lots of people drive cars. This is a great way to start that attacker-minded thinking, to say, how could we open the garage door, as Joe pointed out, grab the car, and play around with your whatever Fast and Furious number they're on now, but set that up as a fun exercise for your engineering team.
Stole my Street Fighter joke, but go ahead.
All right. Well, think of another. We'll have to think of another joke for you while we talk about the next topic. Wiz, we've talked about a couple with them in the past. They've got some great vulns, as well as they've been talking and touching on something that you, I think, have been paying attention to quite a bit, John, about cloud CVEs. So Wiz has now launched the cloudvulndb.org, which is a open source tracker for CVEs or CVE type problems within the cloud. And there's a couple things that we should get into, but one of the things that stood out for me that I didn't appreciate initially was the motivating reason for this is that the CVEs actually have a requirement that the flaw has to be fixable by the consumer. But if it's something that if it's a flaw in something that is not really consumer controlled, or as they're describing, depending on like a shared control or that shared responsibility between the end user, the consumer, and the cloud security provider, that's not something that really falls into a CVE classification by their rules. So it was pretty interesting, just in the sense of, we should have something like this to be able to track vulnerabilities, but we don't, because some of the rules, perhaps, I think it's safe to say CVEs weren't written with cloud in mind, because they date well before cloud was a big thing.
Wow. I have to admit, I hadn't heard that one before. Does that mean now with that's... Let's go see real quick. Does that mean with that CVE on the Honda that the consumer should be able to fix their key code?
Yeah, exactly.
That's interesting. Joe, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No, I interrupted you. I'm sorry about that. Yeah,
no, really,
I never heard of that rule either. That's really interesting, because that wouldn't apply to the cloud really in a lot of cases. So I guess that would make a little bit of sense as to why we don't see more cloud provider related CVEs. It's more of like a vulnerability disclosure, like a briefing,
Right.
rather than an actual CVE with it.
And I think some of it, to pick on an example, some of that we've also seen. Oracle security is another one that hits. So that everybody likes picking on Azure. I think we've covered quite a few of those. But some of the vulnerabilities, they are found by a third party, but then they're fixed by the cloud service provider, by Azure. So I think one of the premises here is that, well, how do we know whether or not a vuln existed in the first place in our cloud hosted MySQL service, and if it was present and fixed, it's still important to know what was the time frame of which I was potentially vulnerable. So I think that's actually one of the motivating factors here too, is that even if the Amazons, Googles, et cetera, are fixing these flaws, having a sense of when I might have been exposed is still important. And I think that's why, without getting too hung up on the details of specifics of a CVE, just saying, here was a flaw, we should know about it and say, either did the service provider fix it because it was their responsibility to do so, but what should I do about it? I guess the what should I do about it is always what comes back to me about this in terms of just what are the good calls to action that we would hope to see come out of a vuln database like this.
Yeah. And to go back to the original point on this one, so this is Wiz. When I was tracking these a few months ago, time flies. Wiz had this one, which they're now sort of coming out of making official, GA 1.0, whatever you want to call it. There's also one from Cloud Security Alliance, which I thought these guys were going to work together on, so I'm a little surprised, but I haven't been watching every single day. They've got global security database, so we now have two competing standards. I hope not. I hope they I think they're going to somehow be able to mesh together. But yeah, I mean, I think it's probably really the benefit for someone like Wiz, right? From the point of view of just thinking through what you're saying there, Mike. Imagine I'm on, I'll say Amazon just because it pops to head, and I'm using their database as a service RDS, and say I'm using it with Postgres. Okay, cool. Let's say MySQL. I know the version number's better. So we're using Aurora DB RDS on Amazon, and there's a vulnerability in 5.7.1 through 5.7.2, but I just switched over to start using version 8. So, how do you actually, this isn't, even someone scanning outside isn't going to notice this, right? You have to be able to have access. You have to have an authenticated scan, basically, not of my application, but of my cloud provider. So it seems like someone like Qualys or Wiz, one of these guys that are able to go in and do that type of scan, this is where this type of data becomes handy to say, hey, this thing you're using, this particular version of it, or you have to, change your key, or you have to do some sort of configuration change to make it secure. So there's definitely value for it, and it's I think one of the things which comes in handy if I put that previous life vendor hat on. You have the customer coming into you saying, I've got this, I don't know, what are they calling these? CVEs? We'll have to come up with a name for them. We have the CVE-like thing. It said I'm vulnerable, but I don't think I am, so how do you prove or disprove or what's going on? So you have to go back through and start doing this verification and validation of it. But if you have definitions around those is where I'm going, you're talking the same language. So it definitely is going to be used by a lot of folks, I think.
Yeah, so we'll definitely track it. Love to see how it would be used by those folks. And you set up a great segue there, John. There's a common language here that's being developed, or a way to talk about and categorize these CVE-like things within the clouds. I've pulled in a white paper from NCC Group about practical attacks against machine learning systems, and against machine learning systems. And listeners, for those of you not seen the audio or video, I had to do the jazz hands for ML. And this was ideally, it's pointing out code is code, and there's a lot of things like path traversal that gets called out, but basically all of the original OWASP top 10, those style of vulnerabilities will be found within ML frameworks, etc. But it gets into section 5. It talks about a good way to classify, or maybe just to categorize and talk about various types of flaws that can come out of a machine learning, both their models and their data sets. It has two other things. One, some good conclusions that point out that these aren't necessarily the highest risk things to be thinking about, but work with your data science teams on threat modeling. Keep these types of attacks in mind. And it has a massive section of references. So if this is an area you really want to learn more about, there's quite a bit of reading you can do beyond just this particular white paper if you just pick out all the references it has at the end.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Joe, thoughts?
That's pretty interesting. It reminds me of when a popular EDR was bypassed or kind of tricked into thinking that malware wasn't actually malware, because an attacker learned how to teach the ML under the hood that this malicious file wasn't actually malicious.
Yeah, they've got some great examples down on where were they? Page, what is this? 12 through 16, where they take some of the standard images that might I'll hit the first one. They've got an image of I guess it's a Bernese mountain dog. The ML figured out pretty quickly. And yes, Joe, when you're on Application Security Week, we have to do rainbow hands when we talk about machine learning. But so the first version of it here, it got the mountain dog. So the top 2 or 3 inferences are mountain dog, English Springer, greater Swiss mountain dog. We're seeing a pattern, right? The ML recognized this thing's a dog. And they perturbed the image by running it through some static, or maybe they lowered, maybe they might have changed. I can't remember. I didn't look too closely at the details, but they might have. Here's me looking at images again. God, I'm so predictable. But they, it looks like they either decreased the quality of the JPEG image or they ran some static across it. And it still is a human, right? That thing a dog. But the inference system went from going, dog to golf cart, feather boa. Oh, it got Bernese mountain dog as number 3. Sulfur crested cockatoo, Afghan hound, mobile home, umbrella. So it quickly just it lost its ability to do anything just by putting a bit of noise into it. It's a really great paper, I thought. You mentioned, Mike, that the TLDR, the conclusion up front, there's 2 or 3 points in there, just really quickly hits that are quite good. Basically training an ML system using sensitive data appears to be fundamentally unsafe. That'll let you sleep well at nighttime. Neural network classifiers appear to be brittle in the sense that they can be easily forced misclassifications. And then the third one we haven't talked about. So I think this is an interesting one to sort of bounce around, probably for upcoming episodes too, guys, is, when you're training an ML system, right, you need, if you're going to do a big data, again, rainbow hands, and you're going to do this very large sort of scale of training this system to be able to recognize GPT-3 or facial image recognition, right? These sort of big popular things we see driving cars. Usually the result of all that training, which happens across at least hundreds, if not thousands of systems, comes back down into something which, you can put into your pocket or into the back of the car, something that's a little more compact. But that means that the actual model, which has been trained, really what training is doing is sort of shifting numbers around, trying to get things to line up and make the dog look like a dog. That's why when you add some static into it, suddenly the computer think ain't no dog. But so that thing now comes down into your, like I said, the phone. But that means the model is on the phone, which means someone with malicious intent, sort of like what you were just hinting at there, Joe. If it's a AV system, or EDR, don't call it AV anymore. You now suddenly have the ability to get that model and start doing some testing offline without people being able to see what you're doing. I haven't seen that tested much as I would expect it to, so maybe that's going to be a future path for some of these folks to start playing with. I mean, I guess what we've seen in past lives is, you think about spam. So people started using some of the open source spam systems and running their spam through it to see how they could tune it and adjust it so that it wouldn't set off the spam filters. So maybe we're talking something sort of that's a similar analog to it, but I think that'd be sort of fun to watch in the future.
Absolutely would be fun. I think the summary I can throw in here is, this is clearly an adversarial environment with any of these ML systems, from perhaps obvious adversarial when we get into face recognition. And we've seen, I forgot to pull in some examples, but we've seen some examples of makeup face paint that is resistant or perturbs, messes up the facial recognition, as well as clothing. So we do have a cyberpunk future ahead of us, a good dystopian one, unfortunately. Perhaps not too dystopian, though. Speaking of Apple, as got mentioned once or twice, they have a new lockdown mode for their iOS devices, for a lot of their devices, for their OS. They announced this at WDC amongst a couple different things. But what lockdown does that's pretty interesting is that it basically reduces the attack surface of a phone, for example, by just saying no, messages aren't going to render links anymore. They're not going to pre-render within iMessage. So they're not. So we've gone beyond just a sandboxing of components, building up things like the blast doors within iMessage, Safari doing process separation, a lot of architectural changes, into, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on your perspective, the reducing attack surface in the sense of disabling a lot of features. Now, the reason I threw a little bit of unfortunate aspect in there is that, on the one hand, this is for very targeted, high-risk users. So amongst the perhaps billion of people with an iPhone, it's a percentage of a percentage where this is really going to help. But it still is, I think, a good way of thinking about security that is in addition to architecture and security architecture, security bug bounties, security scanning, also getting rid of code or disabling features, or just summarizing that as reducing attack surface, still a viable security mentality. So I think that was the area I could exhaust myself on this particular topic now with what I wanted to hit on it. So I'm not sure, Joe or John, you've got your anything to add there, or we should hit one of the other articles.
I think it really highlights how Apple prioritizes the security and privacy of their customers. Just giving you that option to have that enhanced, security feature beyond their already, fairly secure security architecture. It's nice to have. It's nice to see. I wish more companies out there would do things like this.
Interesting. It's they seem, if you look through that list, as you were just reading them off, Mike, they seem like sort of standard hardening concepts. There's nothing really wild here, right? It's not like, as we're just talking about Gatekeeper and some of these other things. It's not super nifty difty high tech. They spend a lot of time. It's like, let's not render images. Or the web browsing one's going to be interesting, because we've been talking in previous episodes about, at least I think it's a matter of time until Apple's going to have to allow others to allow use of other web rendering toolkits on there, not just WebKit. So how then do you do JIT how do you control JIT if it's someone else's? Wired connection one is good. Apple services, sure. So yeah, we can hop onto the other Apple Store or wherever else your lovely mind wants to go. But it's definitely, I think it's a good thing. I'm sort of curious to see how many of the security hipsters out there, and hell, I might fall into this camp on this one, might turn us on, just even if they're not high net worth or high target individuals. They can start getting people saying, "I'm sorry, I couldn't read your message because I've got my security stuff turned up." Let's see where that type of stuff goes.
We'll see. It does have, I didn't pull the article into the show notes for this week, but I was tracking it. Microsoft went back on they had said, we covered about a month ago, saying they're going to disable Excel macros by default. But now they've said that actually we're not going to turn them off by default. We're going to leave them on. And the reason I'm tying that into this is that, John, you were pointing out the idea that, disabling, there are hardening steps to take. And some of the questions about that is, perhaps Joe was pointing out too, is that do you do these by default, or do you have users opt in in. With Excel, Office macros, we've seen that it is clearly an attack vector, but so few people opt into it. It seems smart for Microsoft to say, yeah, we're just going to turn this off by default, and that way everybody benefits from the security. But if we get out of the big organizations that with dozens of people, if you have any security team, especially if you can have it in dozens of people, maybe that's a little bit more viable. If you're talking about small, medium businesses that maybe rely on Excel and Office macros a little bit more, that could be potentially catastrophic to their business workflows. So definitely some trade-offs there. And I suppose maybe some food for thought about how do you decide on what should be that secure default. Speaking of high net worth, there is one. Let's finish up on another hardware hacking. So we talked about cars, and this is now talking about cryptos and cryptocurrency. So I found a write-up about a hardware wallet, which is used to basically to sign transactions, because signing transactions is important if you're moving around the bits that represent some sort of currency one way or the other. But what's interesting about this is that some fun research, a nice write-up that was pointing out, saying that there is design intent of this hardware wallet where it's supposed to, after 30 failed attempts of logging in, this wallet erases itself. So therefore it is, speaking of catastrophic, can block any further attempt to brute force the passphrases for this, as well as it had a 4-byte, if I'm saying it right, 4-byte pin challenge that had ultimately could be brute forced, because rather than being a large 16-bit address space, key space, of trying to guess, they dropped it down to only about 1024 guesses necessary to bypass the pin that was protecting this hardware wallet. So it's the type of thing that the premise is, have a hardware wallet supposed to have some good security guarantees on it to prevent brute forcing, to prevent if anyone picks it up, they can't impersonate you just for guessing your 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 combo on your suitcase. But that was bypassed with a couple links to some software and hardware tools. So pretty fun, good research, kind of not quite hobbyist, but just a good combination of hardware, software. And I think I've exhausted that one in particular. So I don't know if there's anything else there, or if Joe or John, you've got a final article that you want to end us on, maybe.
We got a few good ones. Let's see. Actually, did we hit the Lockbit one yet? We didn't hit it today. I can't remember if we hit it previously.
No, we didn't. No. Bug bounty.
This is, yeah. So we're I think everyone knows we're a fan of bug bounties here on Application Security Weekly, and we've talked a lot about different organizations using these and how they're able to drive improved performance and security handling in their organizations. It turns out some of the ransomware guys think this is sort of a good idea too. So this one in particular is for Lockbit, the ransomware gang that they've been leaving a trail of carnage for the last year or two. And what they're doing in this particular instance is they have created a come on, brain. They've created a bug bounty program, and I'm looking for the numbers. Yeah, there it is. So depending on the actual thing here, they will pay out to either ethical or unethical hackers anywhere from $1,000 to $1 million. And what they're looking for is not specifically a bug. So this is where it becomes, it's not quite like our normal bug bounty programs, but they're looking for PII, personally identifiable information on high net worth individuals. So we can tie it back to that high net worth thing also, Mac. Mm-hmm. Actually, and web exploits, so it's both, not just, before when I saw this, I just saw the first part of that. So they're realizing that, while they've got some good guys and they can do some good hacks and they're becoming fairly successful at what they're doing around the world, hey, let's give this bug bounty thing a try and see if we can sort of improve our leverage, our capability to leverage those vulnerabilities as well. So I think that's sort of interesting. We'll see how, I don't know if we're going to have an ability to, oh, wow. I don't know if we're going to have the ability to actually track how this goes over term. I mean, we've seen what Microsoft and Adobe, I think, and some of the other, and Google maybe not Adobe. I think Adobe actually at one point were talking about how much they're paying out on their bug bounty programs. So does this mean like in 6 months or 12 months we have Lockbit actually putting out a press release saying that in 2022 they released? I mean, I could almost see them doing that sort of as a finger in the eye. They paid out $375,000. Yeah, but I don't know, a little different, but I thought that was fun.
Little different. It definitely points out too, for speaking of threat modeling, make sure that insider threat is on your threat modeling list, because I think this is what Lockbit is also leaning towards, is that they're paying for that sensitive insider information, or what typically might be insider access even as well. But I think that is probably a great way to wrap up for the week. I want to thank you, Joe, for joining us this week. I want to thank you, John, as well, and thank all of our listeners. Make sure to please subscribe, hit that like button, check out the show notes. And speaking of movies with great synth soundtracks, check out Turbo Kid and the band Lamados. And with that, we'll see you next week on Application Security Weekly.